Begin. It is a little bit after, I think maybe a minute after 9:30. I apologize for the late start. But we are beginning our Bible study this morning, so you can get out your workbooks if you have them. If you've been using the worksheets, you can get those out. In a second, we're going to begin what I've called our collaborative review. I thought about breaking you into groups and letting the whole class be 4 groups of collaborative work, but the problem comes into we have pews instead of tables and chairs. It would be a lot more convenient for that learning opportunity. But we're still going to do a collaborative review because that's how you determine if information is sticking in your head. It's really hard to find another metric or method to check your own personal retention other than just testing yourself and seeing if you remember a thing. I noticed something in that process recently in that a few years ago, the bank that we use, our primary bank, changed its name. And so when I sit down at the computer to type in their web address to log in and check my accounts, I stop and I think, okay, the name of this place is, and I go, first my brain goes, it's SunTrust. No, it's not SunTrust anymore, it's Truist. And so I have to type a different name to get to the place to check that knowledge. Now you think that's kind of silly because it's been years now, right? But habits are built by also that same process where you check things. So now every time I sit down, the same process goes through. That's why throughout your life educationally, you've probably been tested often. That's why we also get anxiety over those tests. We stress out about them because we think somebody is going to review our information. That review is going to somehow affect how they see us, even though that's not necessarily always a rational behavior, because most tests like this don't have this high value of this is super important, big deal, big thing. They're just not. And so as the ease to that, we're going to do this often in this class. That's why I'm kind of explaining a lot. Our reviews are all collaborative, but they are a little bit of self-tests. The collaborative part is you can, wait for it, cheat off your neighbor. It's totally fine to look and see what their answer is, because something that's important about understanding how communities of Christians work together, how churches work together, is that we share our expertise with each other. And so you should be looking at the person next to you and saying, hey, what did you get for this? Hey, do you remember where this place is? It's particularly important in doing map work type things. And so James is here. If you need a copy of the map, the primary map we've been using to use for your review, because you don't have one inside your book, this is a couple pages forward from the end of lesson, I think it's 5 or 6 in the book, and James can hand this out to you. This is our review sheet. So raise your hand if you need one, and James will be wandering around to do that. If you've already got the review page in your workbook, James, what's the bottom page of that page number? It says?
17.
Page 17 in your physical books, I think. Is that starting off a worksheet review? Yeah. So you can go there, and this is our process. It's not complicated. We're going to go through that sheet together. James, I know we got one over here too. So we're going to go through that sheet together and take a look at it and try to identify all the spots. The neat thing about this is unlike maybe going on a road trip where you might make a wrong turn somewhere, close enough is good enough. If you get kind of close to the location, that's good enough for answering this. So the level of precision that you want out of yourself beyond that, that's up to you. If you want it to be down to the 10-meter circle, that's up to you, and that's great and awesome. I will tell you, I do not possess that ability to remember the location of all of these places to that detail, so there's no way I would ever expect you to either. But our first set of questions is to use the information in the prompt and to determine approximately where is this mountain space. So our first mountain is something that is snow-covered year-round. Got one more over there, James. So you start thinking about, you can also use your detective skills for some of these questions. If I'm thinking that something is snow-covered year-round, what 2 things are going to be important for that to be the case? How high is the mountain? And then is it common to find snow-covered places year-round in Florida, or would I go in a direction opposite of Florida to find that? Yeah, you could either go north for a while, go up to Canada, you're going to find snow-covered, but if you go south for a while, you're going to find the same thing. They got snow-covered mountains below the equator too. So, but it's going to go north, and so that's going to come you out of this. Hey, there's Mount Hermon, and actually, if it makes you feel any better, it's snowing there right now. It has been over, obviously, on the lower sections of Mount Hermon. If you're going to tie it into your Bible knowledge, just to kind of link it in, Mount Hermon is the likely location for the Transfiguration. And below that area is where you're also going to find a really great, easy tie-in to remember that is where Jesus had the conversation with Peter regarding small stone, big rock, upon this stone. And so now you have kind of a regional connection to a Bible story. Something is famed for its cedars. Yeah. And so that's Mount Lebanon. And so we've got its location there. This one also shouldn't be difficult. It juts into the Mediterranean. Quick question. What's another name for the Mediterranean? Big Sea. The Big Sea, the Great Sea, or the simple answer. It's the sea, right? So that, looking at our little map here, figuring out where that is, shouldn't be that hard, right? It's the only thing that juts in there. East of the city of Jerusalem. So you start thinking about that. Maybe you can look at your map, people next to you. You can kind of cheat around a little bit. Is it cheating when the teacher says you can do it? I don't think so. I think that's probably not the case. So Mount Carmel. And then we have our next location. Is the Twin Mountains on either side of Shechem. One of them is probably more familiar than the other in the sense of biblical stories that you might remember, because its name kind of sounds like another Bible name. Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. If you want a fun fact, Mount Hermon also has a second name. Mount, we would say in English, Baal. But if you're going to try to localize it, kind of like Appalachia, it would be Mount Baal, or Mount Baal is also known for us more commonly as Mount Hermon. That's an important thing because often in that northern region, when the Canaanites were there before the Israelites, their names of locations were awfully associated with the god of the area. And so to many of those northern Canaanites, who the Danites then overtook, Baal or Baal or Baal lived in the mountain. And if you want one more tie-in for that for your brains, remember when I mentioned earlier the dialogue between Jesus and Peter and the nature of Christ is being discussed. They're doing so at the temple of Pan, or Panias, which is carved into the mountain of Mount Hermon. And it's a rock face there. It's a big rock wall there. And Jesus is having this conversation with Peter about a rock when the gods of those people is believed to be in the rock of that mountain. He says, no, upon this rock I will build my church. This is a great visual interplay that we'll talk about when we get back to that story later in the Gospels about the physicality of this space. The range of mountains west of the Jordan. Again, location shouldn't be too hard because it's west of the Jordan, right? And so we should find that spot. That's the Lebanon range. Coming up next, we've got the range of the mountains that are east of the Jordan. If you get one, you should get the other, as a way, if you can remember all the names of the places. And then again, the Jordan begins at its base. I think there's some of those not coming up, like Right, that has to do with the last location, Mount Nebo. All right, now we got a next category. If you remember, if you kind of scroll down, it should shift to names for people in the land. We've given a number of those. So, for the people in the land context, what's the name that comes to us from the Romans that we still use today for this area and people? It's in the news quite a lot, right? I heard someone say it. Palestine, right? Palestine / Palestinians. Note that that's a name attributed to the area in part due to some land formations in the area. So its origin has no real direct connection to the politics of the present day, but it's an important one to use. All right, so our next one, already on the list here. What's the land's second name? We use this one a lot. Well, yeah, but we also have the Promised Land, right? This one we use a lot in our songs. And so we talk about the Promised Land most often describing this area in a poetic sense. Kind of matches how we feel about it. And then we have Yisrael or Israel. What's the origin story for this name? Do you guys remember when it was given to one of Abraham's descendants? Anyone like wrestling? Yeah, this is the wrestling narrative, right? And what does Yisrael or Israel mean? Contend is the root behind it. So again, you have a people following God whose name becomes he who contends with God. And so you start thinking about all the ramifications of you calling yourself, basically, I fight with my God all the time. To a degree. That's the origin story of it. What's a name that means stranger or foreigner? Hebrews, right? Hebrews. If you were to go to, say, England and ask for some coffee, they probably would think that you were a little bit of a foreigner, but he would probably still brew it for you if you kind of put a little link in there. He brews coffee for you, because tea is the big drink in England, and coffee is much more popular here in the U.S. now, especially on the West Coast. So Hebrews, that foreigner context. You can also tie it into the history of the U.S. some way to make it stick in your brain. Southern Kingdom of Judah first picked up this nickname. We use it a lot today. It's actually become the primary designator for the group. Yeah, and this is a problematic word because I was talking about this with Les and Linda. Words kind of float in the soup of time. Right? And as they float down that stream of time, their usage changes dramatically at times. And so as initially given, this abbreviation short name for the descendants of Israel, primarily located in the area of Judah, to call them Jews makes sense. Because it's just kind of cutting off a few extra letters, some consonants and vowels to save them for future use, much like we do with other words. But over time, that word that once had that very localized usage, first in the biblical context spread out really wide and got used to describe a large number of varied groups, genetically, but not always universally talking about individuals who had that same spiritual connection. So in all those instances and contexts, that word has shifted. And then it picked up some dirt along the way and began to be used in a negative context, right? Especially sometimes as an accusation. Sometimes it was marginalization. And so now we have to be careful with our use of a term whose origin is very benign, because it can be misapplied. Because we could say Jews and think historical ancient Israel. Someone else could say Jews today and think marginalized group because of ethnicity. marginalized group because of politics or because of race. And we've got to be really careful. We don't want to necessarily create the wrong outcome. And words function that way. They always move through the soup of time. Even in some of our various phrases that come from our childhood or from our regional experiences, they're also used with a whole lot of baggage, caricatures and such. And so always be careful to think about, what am I using this designator for when it has a context like that could pick up some bad connotations over the years. Descendants of Jacob had a little distinctive term, though. Obviously, we've kind of hinted at part of the word. The answer is Israelites to that. And this one is another familiar context here. The Canaan area, or the Canaanites as the inhabitants of it. Probably of the ones we'll use in this class, it's one of the three most common designators we'll use to describe the region. Palestine, Israel, Canaan. Keep in mind we're using those for different purposes. Palestine, as we use it, is a much larger area. Canaan is a physical space of an area. We use Israel to describe a variety of things. Israel can refer to all the people. Israel can also refer to the size of the nation at a given time, but that size varies. While Palestine as a region is constant for our purposes. Canaan is stuck in its time. When we say Canaan, it's a specific time where it's Canaan and referred to in that regard. And so all of those things, again, come into play when we think about how all these words are used. Next area to think about is our waterway space. What's the main river in the land? Everything is connected to Jordan. If there is one major feature in this map to always remember, to relativize places, it's the Jordan. You can do it with that. You can say it's north of the Jordan. You can say it's south of the Jordan, east and the west, and you're going to really quickly narrow it down, because how big is Israel approximately? What are some of the representations we used?
Fourth size of Georgia or Alabama.
Fourth size, Georgia, Alabama. And kind of you could lay it over the Atlanta metro burb, and you have the same square miles. Shape's different. But you start thinking about how big the Atlanta metro region is, that's essentially approximating the space of the kingdom of Israel at various times. And so you've really got kind of a familiar feel to that. And we do the same thing. We tell people where things are on the basis of, is that up on the north side? How far on the north side is that? Is that inside the loop or outside the loop? How many accidents will I have to endure and survive to get to my destination if I'm driving? Is it like maybe a 1 accident circumstance or a 5 accident circumstance? That budgets our time, right? I don't know about you, but that's how I kind of calculate. If I have to go on the north side, the driving time is an hour. That's not the amount of time it'll take me to get there, or it is. Like there's a mystery based on those things. We do that already. And so we can do that with this Bible map and say, okay, hey, Jordan, okay, I can do all the clockwork around Jordan and figure out where it is. Which river empties into the Dead Sea from the east? Remember our thing from last week? Why jazz? All right, so why jazz? Well, why jazz? I don't know. It's on the eastern side of the Jordan, and the rivers go down according to Y, J, A, and then Z. And so you think, well, I know where the Jordan is. I know where the Dead Sea is. So what's our A river on the east side? It's the Arnon, right? And so you can use that to deduce where you're going to be. What's the river that flows into the Dead Sea from the south? Z is the Zered, so you got your Y jazz working for you. Drains the western portion of the valley of Jezreel. So, okay, wait a minute. I'm going to figure that part out. That's the Kishon River on the other side. I'm not sure I gave you a mnemonic for the western side. The world's lowest freshwater lake. So you start thinking about it. There's only 3 lakes that we've identified in our Bible study of significance so far. They don't always get called lakes, but physically they're lakes, right? What's our biggest one we've identified?
The Dead Sea.
That's the big one's Dead Sea. Is that a freshwater lake? No. And then there's one tiny lake that we've identified, if you guys can remember it. Lake Hula, right, that's the tiny one, but it drains into something else. So it's going down. Sea of Galilee is the the lowest freshwater lake and the largest of its kind in this region. I think you guys should be able to catch this one. It's called the Great Sea in the Bible. Yeah, we call that one the Mediterranean, and we can probably identify it pretty quickly now because I've been constantly reinforcing it. This lake still physically exists in its topography, and there's a small little water basin. But in the time of the scriptures, it was much more full, and we identified it. It's the 3rd water body in the area, Lake Hula. And if you want to get a little mental thing, it is actually fairly circular, and so it's the hula hoop because it's a fairly round lake. If you want to think about ways to attach them. All right. Lowest point on land found on earth. Yeah, we think it's Death Valley if you've been there before on the west coast of the U.S., but no, it's gotten beaten out by the depth of the Dead Sea. And then even below that is the water table, and the water is below that location. And so the wadi that forms the boundary to Egypt has a name that's pretty obvious. It's the River of Egypt. And by the way, wadi is the localized term for a stream or river that is carved in this sense. They're all ones that are carved in the soil because of the water flow. If you're thinking about it in terms of rivers you're used to, if you go up north, there's a number of rivers in the mountain sections of Georgia that would be equivalent to wadis. There is Amicalola, the tributaries into it. They all kind of carve into the rock before they go through the falls. If you come down south into Georgia and they widen out, like the Chattahoochee River, that's not the same kind of river. Still rivers, but they're formed in the topography of the creation of the earth in different ways. Out west, the Grand Canyon is just a massive version of the same thing. If you want to see a modern wadi being formed to a certain degree, you can go to the park that's below Columbus and see basically the formation mechanism taking place as the water carves a little mini canyon into once fertile farmland. What's the Bible name for what we call the Dead Sea? It's pretty on the nose. It's the Salt Sea, right? And our last location is the river between Mount Lebanon and the hills of Galilee for our river areas. It's got a kind of a Greek-looking name. Leontes. Looks Greek to me. I don't know. At least the way it sounds in my head. All right, so now we have one more area to kind of mark down on our next section of the review, which is catching some of the regional small mini nations space. These people control the land between the Arnon and the Zered River. So we got rivers that bound it. So if you remember where the river is, you can kind of catch this. And so what group of people is this?
Moabite.
That's right, some Moabites. Southern coastal plain is our next area. That tells you a couple of things. We're on the coast. Philistines. Hey, and by the way, when you see these things and you remember where they're located and you can start thinking about how this land will look, that will influence your ability to place the stories. So when we talk about the Philistines, we're talking about David, Goliath, and all of the interaction of the early kings with the Philistines. We can say, hey, wait, these are coastal contexts. That's going to shape the way I think about things. Because in our state here, we can drive from Atlanta to Savannah, right? And how does everything change? The trees change when you get down there? Does the look of the place change a little bit? Like I noticed it even going halfway that far near in Augusta, and everything starts taking on a new shape and feel. And so that's the same thing here. You're going to really be able to think about these Bible stories in that way. They turned the sea trade, or to the sea trade very early because their coastal plain was very narrow. So they had a lot of groundwork to deal with. The Phoenicians is our location there. And then they lived on the edge of the desert. The Ammonites. Mount Seir is their stronghold. They are an edge group living on the Edomite side, edge Edomite, and so they're down here on the bottom edge of the map. This group claimed Bashan very early in Israel's history. They'll make an appearance throughout the large part of the middle and end of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible story. Syrians as a group. Damascus becomes a center point for the biblical narratives that swirl out of that group and become part of the eventual Babylonian and Syrian empires, all coalesce to that section of land. All right, this kind of gives you a scaling of things. How far do you think it is from Dan to Beersheba? 150. This is where you get to use your compass, your protractor, or your ruler on those maps. And if you remember your maps, especially the printed ones that are more accurate than the ones we produce as our amateur cartography skills come into play, that scale is super important. And so if you can remember the scale or use that compass or ruler to catch the scale, you can really figure those things out quickly. That also helps you and I visualize time and space in these stories. How long is that? A walking journey for you or I in the range of 10 to 20 miles is something to kind of catch in a day. Yes, you can walk farther than that in a day, and yes, trained hikers do that. But if you're walking as a family unit or as part of your day-to-day endeavors, you're not going to trek it out like you're on a forced march. And so 10 to 20 mile range is think about a day's trip, if you will, especially if you're carrying a lot of stuff or people with you. That's why it takes so long in some of those stories for everyone to get anywhere, is part of that factor. Mount Hermon to the Dead Sea, 120 miles. But remember, how long is the river that goes from Galilee to Jordan? I didn't say the distance from Galilee to Jordan. How long is that river?
300 miles.
It's like 200 miles, I think, is the river. The river system itself winds, it curves that way. So The mile itself is 200. It's 200 miles of river for 80 miles of distance. I can't remember if that's going to be a question, but either way, I gave you the answer to that question. Length of that Rift Valley. This is 4,000 miles, if you will. Not just the Rift Valley on our map, but the whole carving that goes from our European continent edge here into the Asiatic continent and then down into the African continent. This whole Rift Valley carves that same way. I always think it's important to catch how small relative to the rest of the map the story is. A way to think about that is if you were to plot a map to drive, I think it's from the coast of Texas all the way up to the nearest northern edge of the United States, and get some scale involved here, half of your drive on that thing would still be in Texas. So you would not leave the panhandle for half of your drive, and that's still not 4,000 miles. So you start thinking about the math of how this rift context functions. What's the width of Canaan at its tippy top spot? 30 miles. What's the width of Canaan? Southern end of the Dead Sea. So that's going from the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea over to the edge of the Great Sea. From sea to smelly sea, because the Salt Sea does not smell good. So Mediterranean smells great.
Around 50 miles.
So look at there. Mathematics and estimation match out there. 55 miles is the more specific distance. Dead Sea to Jerusalem, that spot, or the top of it, or Jerusalem to Jericho, in those same spaces will be our next kind of comparative amount. Look, you're kind of eyeballing it once you get enough eyeball. 15, 20 miles is about right. So I want you to think about that for a moment. That is essentially a day's walk. It is not a day's pleasant walk. Well, you can make that distance in a day, especially if you're going. It's easier to go from Jerusalem to Jericho than Jericho to Jerusalem. Elevation change is a big thing, and it's awful and dry all the way up. And so think about the physicality of that part. Jordan Riverbed, I already mentioned this, that's the length of it. 80 miles, but it doesn't travel 80 miles. It goes much longer. Jordan River to the desert on the plateau, 25 miles. Joppa to Gaza. Joppa and Gaza are both locations that will have ramifications in the biblical story. That's 40 miles along the coast there. Much more pleasant walk. It also regionalizes it in your mind as you start thinking about these spaces that way too. Our northern El River, our Greek-sounding Leotes River to Jezreel. That's about a 50-mile space. All right, let's get into our cities here. The northern city in Israel's control for most of its existence would be Dan, right? And if you want to think about Dan, it's got lots of rivers and streams, very green and lush. And so if you're thinking about things, there's going to be a lot of greenery, a lot of plants, whereas the southern part turns to more desolate spaces. If you're thinking about like where the waterfalls are, where the rocky clear water comes from, it's all up there. This is also where the snow mountains produce all that water. So all that snow melts off in the spring and produces a lot of these rivers raising their levels.
First two places I filled in when I was doing my map was Dan and Beersheba.
Yeah.
Southern and northern tip.
And just go right to the beginning and end of it. Just go ahead and put those in. And the more you lock it into your brain, the more likely when you sit down to look at this stuff, like I know where this is, I know where this is, oh, and I know where this is. So they start to lock together like a puzzle, and the picture becomes more apparent. Best natural harbor in the area. Tyre and Sidon, this upper area, have the natural harbors, these two cities up here. Remember, a natural harbor doesn't mean it's necessarily a place where trade occurs. Natural harbor just means it's good for that. Caesarea Philippi and Caesarea Maritima, two separate places, have locations that are good for trade for different reasons, not because of their harbor status physically, although they fixed that later, because when Caesarea Maritima, out on the coast, eventually gets built out, they make a harbor. And as you can imagine, just imagine running a dock out at the lake, where they just make this big giant L, and they have a dock out to the deep part of the lake. That's pretty much what they do there. They just do it by floating out sand and rocks and dump it there, and eventually have enough to get above the water level, and that soothes the water inside. We do that today to a certain degree with engineering to build out artificial harbors. We've got airports, one's sinking in Japan, I think right now. It's gradually sinking about an inch every couple of years. I'm trying to figure out how to solve that. I think is it Tokyo Narita Airport? I don't know. One of them. It's a southern airport in the major Tokyo area is sinking, if I remember right. I'll have to ask Trey about it more, see if he's landed there, but we're getting close on time here. A city in the Negev, or Negev, built around the wells that Abraham dug. Les gave us his answer already, right? Beersheba. You can actually go to the archaeological sites around Beersheba, and you can see many of the contemporary wells that they've excavated. Some of them have been closed over. The water table has shifted because of the change in water availability in the region, and so there's no water at the bottom of it anymore. But all of these southern cities are supplied by hand-dug wells of various sizes. And so we'll get a chance to look at some of that too when we come back to those stories. This particular city has a name that connects to a lot of the way we read our Bible today still. Megiddo has another name. Harmageddon is another name for Megiddo. Does that sound like an English word you may have heard? Armageddon. It comes from this same location. We pull that word forward and we use it now. Again, it's floated through history. And Armageddon can mean not just a city, right? Armageddon could also mean a big destructive event. Oh, you've just caused Armageddon. Remember, Megiddo itself is a city that was destroyed. And so there's a bit of that. And because of closeness of words, it gets misunderstood at times in poetic or prophetic literature. And we think they're not talking about Armageddon. We think they're talking about Armageddon. You know, we shift its meaning sometimes. Got to be careful with that particular word. Great trading center of the Philistines. I tried to figure out a way to link Buc-ee's and Gaza, but I couldn't figure it out. But if you think about how a Buc-ee's functions, Buc-ee's are placed in the middle space between two major population centers. That's how they figure out where they're going to place their thing. And so if you're driving south to the major population centers below Atlanta, you're going to find a Buc-ee's there. And if you're driving north, what do you find up there? A Buc-ee's. One Buc-ee's between here and Chattanooga. One Buc-ee's between here and Florida. That's kind of how Gaza functions. It's kind of a halfway point between the next major habitable areas. That meant caravans, trade groups, routes would always go through there, and you would stop, you would fill up on water, you would fill up on supplies, you would make sure you had feed for your camels, feed for your people before you made the next journey to the next center. And so these population centers function in the same way. We got 4 zones. They should be on your mental map. But what's our furthest zone to the other sides? Well, it's the coastal, the plain, the hill country, and then you've got down low, hill country is the upper section. Jordan Valley, Trans-Jordan Plateau. You go out a little farther, you find our dry, rugged area, which is going to be the Araba. That's the God's sowing, if you will, is the name of that region, down in the south below the Dead Sea. And then we have the Greek name for a valley section, which is that Jordan Valley area. That's the Eshkelon or Estrelon. And I think we got time, just a minute, to do a few more. Plains of Sharon is our first little coastal section. This has two different pronunciations in the Bible. The Negev or the Negeb is that section around the Buckies, otherwise known as Gaza. So I have forced your association with Gaza and Buckies rather than made it a mnemonic. Maybe it'll stick. What's an area that's got hot, dry, eastern wind? This is an uncommon word. We won't see it very much. Is the Sirocco is the term for that. Western rugged slopes on the side of the Dead Sea. Wilderness of Judea. If you want to visualize it and go on your maps, that's where Masada is located. And so you think about big elevated towers of rock, much like the western U.S. has that section where you got these big pillars of rock out in the middle of nowhere. That's how kind of the edge of this feels. It feels like you're on the edge of a canyon side there. Another name for the Jordan Valley for today's usage is the El Gore. Low-rolling hills between the coastal plain and the hill country of Judah are referred to as the Shephelah. And then this last section for us here, this is one of our trade route considerations. What's the trade route that's along the coastal plain? The Way of the Sea. What's the next one over? It's the Way of Shur. And what's our last one? King's Highway. And that's the one that connected kingdoms. The longer one that worked around all of that. So here's the thing to think about. I had intended to squeeze this review into a smaller time frame, but we stretched it out. I'd hope to get about half of that time. That's fine. So that means that Trey, when he teaches next week, is going to be going over the first part of this big map. You already have the material for it. It was handed out earlier. It's also in the emails. We've got copies of it back there. And so we're going to look at a bigger view. So we're taking our lens, zooming out, and saying, what's going around all of this? The first half of that conversation is during the time of what we would say the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And then we're going to shift our table a little bit. And then probably that will be 2 Sundays from now when I'm back teaching again. It will be the New Testament additions to this map. And so this right here is the map that we're going to be paying attention to next. Trey will be teaching some of that for next Sunday. So you can pepper Trey with all the questions you want, give him all the hard ones, the complicated ones, and he can either answer them or write them down for me for later. Both options are fine. But I really appreciate your participation today, and thanks everyone.